I hired a guy to mow the lawn, but he called and whispered, "Ma'am, there's someone in your basement. I can hear crying." I froze. My husband said the basement had been sealed for 20 years. I grabbed the key and slowly walked down. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to believe that the house on Clover Mill Road was the safest place in the world. Raymond and I had bought it in 1987, when Dennis was just a boy with grass-stained knees and a gap-toothed smile. We'd painted the porch ourselves, planted the rose bushes along the south fence, hung a wind chime by the kitchen window that sang every time a storm came through. After Raymond passed, 4 years ago now, quietly, in his sleep, the way a good man deserves to go, the house became my anchor. I was 71 years old, reasonably healthy, and perfectly capable of managing my own life. Thank you very much. I had my garden. I had my neighbor Patricia 2 doors down. I had my Tuesday Bible study group and my Friday trips to the farmer's market. I was not lonely. I was not lost. I was simply a woman living in the home she'd built with her own hands and her own love. Dennis worried about me, or so he said. He started coming around more often after Raymond died. At first I thought it was grief, his way of staying close to his father's memory. He'd sit at my kitchen table and drink my coffee and talk about the property taxes, about the roof that would need replacing in a few years, about whether I'd considered downsizing to something more manageable. I'd smile and pour him more coffee and change the subject. The house was paid off. The house was mine. There was nothing to manage except my own contentment. Then he married Cheryl. I want to be careful here, because I'm not the kind of woman who dislikes a daughter-in-law on principle. I gave Cheryl every chance. I invited her to Thanksgiving, to Easter, to Raymond's memorial service in the spring. She came with her highlighted hair and her firm handshakes and her way of looking at my furniture like she was already pricing it. She called me Marjorie when everyone who knew me called me Marge. It was a small thing. Small things have a way of adding up. It was Cheryl's idea, I found out later, to seal the basement. Raymond had used it as a workshop. It still smelled of sawdust and machine oil. After he died, I'd go down there sometimes just to sit and feel him near. Then one spring, Dennis came by with 2 workers I'd never met and told me there was a moisture problem, a mold risk, that the stairs were a liability. He had it sealed within a week. New drywall over the door, a coat of paint the color of old cream. He showed me the contractor's invoice, $3,000, which he said he'd paid himself as a gift. What kind of mother argues with a gift? I told myself it was love. I told myself a lot of things. The first strange sign came 6 months after the sealing. I was in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. I've always been a poor sleeper, making chamomile tea, and I heard something beneath the floor, a sound so faint I might have dreamed it, a rhythmic tapping. I stood very still with my mug in both hands, listening. It stopped. I told myself it was pipes. Old houses breathe in the night. I went back to bed. The second sign was Dennis himself. He began stopping by unannounced, not weekly, but sometimes twice in a week, always with some excuse. A casserole from Cheryl, a light bulb he'd noticed was out last time. He never stayed long, but he always walked through the house in that particular way of his, glancing toward the sealed wall in the hallway, then relaxing slightly when everything looked undisturbed. I noticed, but I told myself I was imagining things. At 71, you start to doubt your own perceptions. People encourage you to, The third sign was the smell. It was faint, and it came and went, and I couldn't place it for weeks. Something organic. Something that didn't belong in a house where only one old woman lived and kept things very clean. I scrubbed the kitchen. I checked the refrigerator. I had the garbage disposal serviced. The smell remained, rising sometimes from the floorboards near the hallway, gone before I could track it. I hired Tyler Beaumont to cut the grass on a Wednesday in late September. He was 19, Patricia's nephew's boy, quiet and polite and thorough. I was at my book club across town when my phone rang. I saw his name on the screen and answered, expecting something ordinary. A question about the edging, maybe, or the back gate latch. But his voice was barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, there's someone in your basement. I can hear crying." I stood in Patricia's sister's living room with my phone pressed to my ear and did not breathe. "Tyler," I said, "are you certain?" "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "It's coming through the window well on the north side. Somebody's down there. Somebody's crying." My husband had told me that basement was sealed for 20 years. I drove home in 11 minutes. I sat in the driveway for a long moment, looking at my house, my safe, familiar, beloved house, and felt it become something I didn't recognize. Then I took the key from the glove box. I walked to the front door, and I went inside. The sealed wall in the hallway had always bothered me more than I let on. Not for any reason I could name precisely, just the blunt wrongness of it, a door-shaped absence in a house that had always been open to itself. Dennis had done a tidy job. The drywall was smooth, the paint matched. But if you ran your fingers along the baseboard, you could feel where the old doorframe sat beneath, patient as a held breath. Tyler was waiting on the porch. He was pale and keeping his voice low, though we were alone. He showed me the window well on the north side of the house. A half-moon of concrete sunk below grade, the kind Raymond had installed for ventilation decades ago. The glass was fogged from inside. And when we stood very still in the cool September air, I heard it. Not loud, almost nothing, in fact. A sound like a woman trying not to make any sound at all. I told Tyler to wait in his truck and to call 911 if I didn't come back out in 10 minutes. He started to argue. I looked at him the way I used to look at Dennis when he was 12 and testing me, and Tyler walked to his truck. I went to the garage for Raymond's pry bar. I am not a large woman. I am 5'3", 140 pounds, with arthritis in my left hand that makes cold mornings difficult. But I have also re-roofed a garden shed, replaced a hot water heater, and once changed a tire on the interstate at 64 years old in the rain. I know how to use tools. I know how to use them with intention. The drywall came away from the frame in 3 sections. Behind it was the original door. Hollow core wood, painted over, the hinges intact. The knob had been removed and the hole plugged with a rubber stopper. I pulled the stopper out. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Beneath it, beneath the sourness and the closed-in air, was something human. Soap. Sweat. The faint sweetness of someone who had been eating very little. The stairs were dark. I found the string for the old pull bulb light at the bottom. Raymond had never updated the fixture. And the basement filled with pale yellow light. She was in the corner behind Raymond's old workbench. A young woman, perhaps 25, small, dark-skinned, with close-cropped hair and eyes that had gone very wide and very still at the light. She was sitting on a folded blanket with a plastic bucket nearby and a case of water bottles stacked against the wall and a paper bag that had once held food. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt that was too large for her and clean socks, which struck me later as one of the saddest details. That someone had thought to give her clean socks. We looked at each other. She spoke first. Her voice was barely a sound. "Are you his mother?" I said. "Yes, I am." And then I sat down on Raymond's old shop stool because my legs had stopped cooperating, and I said, "Can you tell me your name?" "Amma," she said. "Amma Asante." I will not describe everything Amma told me that afternoon because some of it is hers to tell or not tell, and some of it later became part of a legal record, and some of it I am not yet able to put into plain language without my hands shaking. What I will tell you is the shape of it. She had come from Ghana 2 years earlier on a student visa. She had met Cheryl through a church outreach program. Cheryl had offered her a room, cheap rent, a safe neighborhood, while Amma sorted out a work authorization complication. Within 2 months, Cheryl and Dennis had taken Amma's documents. They told her she'd be deported if she went to anyone. They told her she owed them money for the room, for the food, for their silence. They moved her to the basement. They listed her on a fraudulent lease agreement to collect housing assistance in her name. They had been doing this, the fraud, the confinement, for 14 months. 14 months? I sat in my husband's basement in my husband's house, and I looked at this young woman and I thought, how much of my life has been built on things I chose not to look at closely? That thought was dangerous. I let myself have it for exactly 90 seconds. Then I put it away. There are 2 ways to respond to a catastrophe. You can collapse into the grief of it, or you can make a list. I have always been a list person. Raymond used to tease me about it. You'd make a list at the end of the world march. Maybe so, Raymond. Maybe so. Here is what I knew. Amma needed medical attention. Amma needed her documents recovered. Dennis and Cheryl needed to be held accountable. Legally. Formally. Without any possibility of a quiet family resolution that let them walk away. And I needed to move carefully, because Dennis would know something had changed the moment I acted, and Dennis was 45 years old and not kind, and had access to lawyers. Here is what I decided. I would not call 911 from the house. I didn't know if Dennis had any way of monitoring the property. A camera I hadn't noticed, a neighbor he'd cultivated. I would get Amma out first. I would take her somewhere safe. And then I would make the calls that could not be undone. I helped Amma up the stairs. Tyler, God bless him, was still in his truck. He drove us to Patricia's house without asking a single question, which told me he already understood that questions could wait. What does a mother do when she discovers her son is a monster? She makes a list. She keeps moving. She does not look away a second time. Patricia Odom has been my neighbor for 22 years, and she is the kind of woman who, when you arrive at her door with a half-starved stranger and a look on your face that says, "Don't ask yet," puts the kettle on and pulls out the good blanket from the hall closet. That is what she did. She put Amma on the couch with the blanket and a bowl of chicken soup from the pot she kept simmering on Wednesdays, and she sat across from me at her kitchen table while I used her landline. Deliberately, consciously, not my cell phone, to call the police. I asked for a detective. I said I had a situation involving false imprisonment and document theft and suspected fraud, and that I needed someone senior, and that I was not going to repeat myself to 4 different people before someone took me seriously. There was a pause. Then they transferred me to a Detective Reyes, who had a level, careful voice and who listened without interrupting for 6 minutes while I explained in precise order what I had found and what I had been told. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said when I finished, "I need you and Ms. Asante to come in, tonight, if possible." "We'll be there in an hour," I said. The police station was a 40-minute drive. Patricia drove. I didn't trust my hands on the wheel just yet. Amma sat in the back seat, freshly washed and wearing a sweater of Patricia's that was slightly too wide in the shoulders, and she looked out the window at the passing streetlights with an expression I recognized from my own mirror in the days after Raymond died. The face of someone recalibrating what the world is. Detective Reyes was a compact man in his 40s, with a legal pad and reading glasses he kept taking on and off. He interviewed Amma first, with a female officer present and a victim's advocate from the county who arrived within 30 minutes. Faster than I expected. I waited in the hallway on a plastic chair, and I was grateful for the plastic chair's cold practicality. Gratitude for small, solid things was carrying me a long way that night. Then he interviewed me. I told him everything. The ceiling of the basement, which I now understood, had happened not because of moisture, but because Amma had been moved there, and Dennis needed to control access. The smell. The tapping I'd heard at 2 a.m. and dismissed as pipes. The unannounced visits. The way Dennis always checked the wall and then relaxed. I told him about the fraudulent lease. Amma had described how Cheryl had drawn it up, how Dennis had filed it, how they deposited the monthly assistance payments into a joint account Amma had never been permitted to access. "Do you have any documentation of your own, Mrs. Hawkins?" Detective Reyes asked. "Not yet," I said, "but I know where to look." This was true, because I am organized in the way that only people who've managed a household alone for decades can be organized. Raymond had kept a fireproof lockbox in the bedroom closet. I had kept it after his death, and I had added to it. Property documents, insurance policies, the deed. But I also remembered, now, with the cold clarity of a woman who has just rearranged everything she thought she knew, that the previous January, Dennis had asked if he could store some paperwork at my house while he and Cheryl were between filing systems. I had let him put a folder in the file cabinet in the spare room without looking at it. At the time, it had seemed like nothing. I asked Detective Reyes if he could have someone accompany me back to the house. An officer named Carver drove me home at 11:30 that night. I went directly to the spare room. I opened the file cabinet. The folder Dennis had left was still there, manila, unlabeled. Inside it, a lease agreement, dated 14 months prior, bearing Ama Asante's signature. Or something meant to look like it. A printed bank routing form. A letter on County Housing Authority letterhead confirming monthly payments. And a handwritten note in Cheryl's rounded, careful cursive that said only, D. Keep this off-site. Don't want it anywhere near the house in case. Officer Carver photographed every page. He bagged the folder as evidence. He was quiet and professional and did not editorialize, but when he turned to leave, he said, "You did the right thing, ma'am," in a voice that meant it. I stood in my spare room and held the edge of the file cabinet because the room was tilting very slightly. When does a mother stop being a mother and start being a witness? I didn't have an answer. What I had was a case number. I had Reyes's card. I had the certain knowledge that by morning Dennis would know something had moved. Tyler had parked his truck in front of my house for 20 minutes, the basement wall was open, and Dennis had at least one neighbor he was friendly with on the next block. He would come. He would try to manage me the way he had always managed me, with a patient voice and a reasonable explanation and the subtle implication that I was old and emotional, and perhaps not thinking clearly. I went to bed at 1 a.m. I did not sleep particularly well, but I slept, because what Dennis didn't know yet was that this time, I had already stopped being manageable. By Thursday morning, the plan had 3 parts. I had written them on a yellow legal pad the night before, when sleep kept sliding away from me. First, ensure Amma had legal representation and medical care, independent of anything I could provide. Second, cooperate fully with Detective Reyes's investigation and provide any additional documentation he requested. Third, consult my own attorney, Howard Pell, who had handled Raymond's estate and was a careful, unshowy man I trusted, before Dennis had the chance to complicate matters legally. I called Howard at 8:15 in the morning. He picked up on the third ring. "Marjorie," he said, "this is not a simple situation." "No," I agreed. "But I'm not asking for simple, I'm asking for thorough." He told me to come in at noon and to bring whatever documentation I had retained. He also told me, gently but clearly, to stop answering Dennis's calls until we had spoken, which meant that when Dennis called at 8:47, then again at 9:12, then again at 9:58, I watched the phone light up from across the kitchen and let it ring. Patricia had taken Amma to the county medical center that morning. The victim's advocate, a woman named Darlene, who wore orthopedic shoes and spoke with precise, steady kindness, had connected Amma with an immigration attorney named Gerald Park, who had handled asylum and trafficking cases for 15 years. Gerald moved fast. By 10 o'clock, a formal request had been filed to halt any deportation proceedings and to flag Amma's visa situation for review under trafficking protections. Her documents, Detective Reyes informed me by phone, would be a matter for the investigation. But the legal protections were in place. Amma was safe, not healed. That would take time none of us could schedule. But safe. I was in Howard's office on Elm Street reviewing the documentation when my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered. "Mom?" Dennis's voice was compressed into something I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager caught in a lie. "I need to talk to you. Now." "I'm with my attorney," I said. Silence. Then, "Your attorney?" "Yes, Dennis." Another silence. Different in quality. Thicker. Colder. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, and ended the call. They were at my house when I returned that afternoon. Both of them. Dennis's car was in my driveway at an angle that was slightly too aggressive, the way people park when they want to signal occupation. Cheryl was on my porch, and she had done something to her face that was meant to look like concern. "Marjorie," she said when I got out of the car, "we need to talk. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding." I walked past her and unlocked my door. I let them in because I wanted to look at them and because Howard had told me that a recorded conversation, my phone in my pocket, running, might be valuable, and because I am 71 years old and I have looked difficulty in the face before. Cheryl sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had served them coffee for years. And she told me that Amma had been a troubled young woman, that she and Dennis had tried to help her, that the housing arrangement had been informal and misrepresented by Amma herself, that they were victims, too, of a manipulative person who was now using an old woman's good intentions against her own son. She spoke for approximately 4 minutes. It was a well-organized speech. I suspected she had rehearsed it. "And the note," I said, when she finished. "In Cheryl's handwriting, in my file cabinet, the one that says, 'Keep this off-site.' What does that misunderstanding look like?" Dennis's expression changed. In that moment, he looked less like my son and more like a person calculating odds. I watched it happen. I had never seen it so plainly before. Perhaps because I had never made him feel genuinely cornered before. "You need to withdraw your statement," he said. "If you don't, this will go places none of us want it to go. I have documentation that you've shown signs of cognitive decline. Howard Pell will not look credible beside a geriatric specialist I can bring in who has concerns about your—" "Stop," I said. He stopped. "I am recording this conversation. What you just described is witness intimidation. You might want to call your own attorney before you say anything else." Cheryl stood up very quickly. Dennis went pale. Not red, as I might have expected, but pale, the blood leaving his face with remarkable efficiency. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Cheryl. Cheryl looked at her handbag. They left. My hands were trembling after, but only slightly, and only for a few minutes. I made tea. I sat in Raymond's chair by the front window and watched Dennis's car back unevenly out of the driveway. I thought, this is not over. But I have not lost. Those are different things, and it matters to know the difference. I gave myself 4 days. Patricia came by each evening. We watched old films, and she didn't ask me to be braver than I was already being. On the 3rd day, I slept 8 hours for the first time in a week. On the 4th day, I was ready again. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday by certified mail. Inside was a letter on the stationery of a downtown firm I'd never heard of, Kellner, Roth & Associates, and a cashier's check for $40,000. The letter was written in the measured language of people who are paid by the word to sound reasonable. It described a proposed private settlement of all outstanding concerns. It noted that my son and his wife wished to preserve family unity and avoid the trauma of public legal proceedings. It listed, in a footnote styled as an afterthought, 4 names: doctors, specialists, who had agreed to provide affidavits regarding age-related cognitive vulnerability in elderly witnesses. I read it twice. I set it on the kitchen table beside my coffee cup. I looked at the check. $40,000 is a great deal of money, and not enough money. And Dennis knew both things when he sent it. I photographed the letter and the check and sent both images to Detective Reyes and to Howard Pell within 10 minutes of opening the envelope. Howard called back in 20. Attempted bribery of a witness, he said, with a satisfaction he was professionally obligated to understate. Don't cash it, don't return it, don't touch it again. Leave it exactly where it is. The check sat on my kitchen table for 11 days while it became part of the evidence file. Every morning, I made my coffee and looked at it and felt nothing in particular, which surprised me at first. I had expected anger or grief or some complex mixture of both. What I felt instead was a kind of clarifying cold, the sort of cold that burns away the inessential. Was Dennis always this person? I asked myself that question a great deal during those days. I didn't arrive at a satisfying answer. Perhaps some people are always what they become, and the circumstances simply remove the camouflage. Perhaps I had seen the early signs, the small cruelties, the entitled reasoning, the way he'd looked at my house even when Raymond was alive, and chosen to call them something gentler. Mothers do that. It is both our strength and our precise undoing. But I was not undone. Gerald Park called on Wednesday to update me on Amma's situation. Her visa status had been formally reclassified under federal trafficking protections, which meant she had a legal right to remain in the country while the investigation was active and potentially well beyond it. She was staying with a host family connected through an immigration services network, a couple in their 50s named the Oyalarans, who had done this before and knew how to make space without making demands. Gerald said she was eating well. He said she had asked about me. I drove to see her on Thursday. She was sitting in the Oyelaran's sunlit kitchen, and she looked different than she had in my basement. Not unrecognizable, but expanded somehow, as if being in natural light had returned her to a fuller version of herself. She stood up when I came in. We did not hug immediately because we didn't quite know each other yet in the way that permits that, but she took my hand in both of hers and held it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," I told her. "Thank me when it's finished." We sat together for 2 hours. She told me more about her life, her family in Accra, her plan to study environmental engineering, the church outreach meeting where Cheryl had approached her with a warm smile and a laminated card describing available housing. I told her about Raymond, about the basement as it had been, full of sawdust and projects half finished. We made the space something other than what it had been. Darlene, the victim's advocate, invited me to attend a community support group meeting that Friday. Not for victims, she clarified, but for family members who had found themselves at the intersection of someone they loved and something terrible. I went, mostly out of stubbornness. There were 7 people in a church basement, and a woman named Connie who ran the group with calm practicality and coffee in a styrofoam cup that was better than it had any right to be. I came back the following Friday and the Friday after that. Patricia organized, without asking me, a quiet network of people who began checking on me. Not intrusively, not with the suffocating softness people sometimes bring to the elderly, but practically. A casserole left on the porch. A text that said only, "Thinking of you. Respond if you want. Don't if you don't." Tom Beaumont, Tyler's uncle, offered to park his truck in my driveway twice a week so the house looked less unoccupied. I accepted. What does it mean to be supported? I had thought for years that it meant being protected from difficulty. I learned that autumn that it means something simpler and more sustaining. It means being seen clearly by people who do not require you to be less than you are while you do the hard thing anyway. Dennis and Cheryl were watching. I knew it. They were waiting for a crack. A moment of wavering, a late-night call when I might be tired enough to negotiate. The phone was quiet. The check sat on my table. I waited too, but I did not waver. They came on a Sunday afternoon, which was deliberate. Sunday afternoons have a particular texture. Slower, softer. The week's armoring not yet back in place. Dennis had always been observant in small, tactical ways. He knocked rather than used the bell, which was also deliberate. A bell sounds like a demand. A knock can be made to sound tentative, even humble. I looked at them through the side window before I opened the door. Dennis was wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before. Soft gray, the kind of jacket worn to signal calm, harmlessness, someone who has reconsidered. Cheryl had brought flowers. Pale yellow dahlias wrapped in craft paper, tied with twine. She had taken care with them. That, too, was deliberate. I let them in. I did not take the flowers. "We've been doing a lot of thinking, Mom," Dennis said, sitting at the kitchen table. He always sat at the kitchen table, as if the familiarity of the location meant something, as if it could metabolize what was happening into something ordinary. "We made mistakes. We want to make this right." "Tell me what right looks like to you," I said. Cheryl set the flowers on the counter and folded her hands with a practiced composure that I recognize now for exactly what it was. A performance, and not a particularly original one. Amma is being taken care of. She's safe. She's with people. The worst is over for her. Dragging this through a courtroom, for months, maybe years, doesn't undo anything. It only creates more pain. For everyone. She paused. And in the pause, she tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they want to appear to be feeling something. "For you, Marjorie. Think about what this does to you." "I am thinking about what it does to me," I said. "You'd be testifying against your own son," Dennis said. His voice had dropped into something almost gentle. I recognized the register. It was the voice he'd used as a teenager to negotiate curfews, to explain away bad grades, to make me feel that my instincts were the problem. The press will be involved. Our family name. Dad's name. Everything you and Dad built here. Don't, I said. He paused. Don't use your father, I said. Raymond would not recognize you right now, and I think some part of you knows that. Something shifted in Dennis's face. Not remorse. I need to be accurate here, even if accuracy is unpleasant. What shifted was the mask. Not the person behind it becoming visible, exactly, but the mask slipping just enough to show that there was a mask. His expression hardened at the jaw. The gentleness receded like a tide that had only ever been decorative. You're a 71-year-old woman living alone, he said. The legal process is slow and expensive and exhausting. Howard Pell is good, but he's a state law. This will go beyond him. You'll be deposed, repeatedly. Your memory, your mental state, your fitness as a witness, all of that becomes fair game. Kellner and Roth have resources that... You're threatening me, I said. I'm being realistic, he said. You're threatening your mother, I said, at her own kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with flowers your wife bought to soften the threat. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of everything the three of us were not saying, full of 30 years of Sunday dinners and holiday phone calls and small surrenders I had made in the name of keeping peace in a family that, it turned out, had not been keeping peace at all. It had simply been keeping quiet. Those are not the same thing. I had confused them for a long time. Cheryl stood up. This is a mistake, she said. But she was speaking to Dennis, not to me. The first honest thing she'd said since they arrived. He stood too. The kitchen felt smaller than it had been. I am not a physically imposing woman. I am aware of this. But I did not move from my chair. If you proceed, Cheryl said, and now the warmth was entirely gone from her voice, stripped away to something efficient and cold. We will make this as difficult as possible. For you and for that girl. Amma, I said. Her name is Amma. They left. The kitchen door closed behind them, and I heard Dennis's car start in the driveway and pull away too quickly. Gravel scattering across the concrete in a small, petulant spray. I sat at the table for a while. The dahlias were still on the counter. Outside, a car passed slowly on Clover Mill Road, a neighbor, probably, coming home from church, and the ordinary sound of it was steadying in a way I hadn't expected. Life outside this kitchen was continuing at its normal pace. That mattered. I want to be honest. I was afraid. Not of the legal process. I trusted Howard. I trusted Reyes. I trusted that facts, when properly marshaled, have a weight that emotional pressure cannot displace. What I was afraid of was something older and more irrational. The fear a mother carries like a stone in her chest, that loving someone does not protect you from what they become, that you can do everything right and still sit in your own kitchen being threatened by the child you taught to tie his shoes, who learned to read at your knee, who you held through fevers and disappointments and the particular grief of a boy losing his father. Is this the worst of it? I asked myself. Or is there more? There was more. There is always more. But here is what I also knew, sitting in the kitchen with the afternoon light going orange on the walls. Fear, when you don't let it stop you, doesn't weaken you. It clarifies. It strips away everything that was never essential and leaves you standing in the exact center of what matters. I picked up the dahlias and put them in a vase with water. They were pretty flowers, and they hadn't done anything wrong. Then I called Detective Reyes and told him about the visit. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "Good. That's all on record now." 4 words. Exactly enough. The trial did not happen all at once the way it does in films. It happened over 4 months of pretrial motions and depositions, and mornings in Howard's office, reviewing documents I had already reviewed, and afternoons in Detective Reyes's conference room, reviewing others. It happened in small increments, in legal language that was not designed for clarity, in a process that was thorough in the way that only slow things can be thorough. I attended every session I was permitted to attend. I took notes in a spiral notebook with a blue cover. I wore the same cardigan most days because its weight across my shoulders felt like company. I don't regret the slowness. Slow meant solid. The hearing that broke everything open was on a Thursday in late January. The courtroom was county level, not dramatic in size or architecture, fluorescent lit and practical, with a judge named Rosario who had 22 years on the bench and a face that conveyed, without theater, that she had heard everything and was not interested in performance. Amma testified first. She had been preparing for weeks with the prosecution team and with Gerald and, I believe, in the quiet way that people prepare for things that require them to go back into rooms they would rather not enter. She sat in the witness chair in a dark blue blazer, and she spoke clearly, and she did not look at Dennis and Cheryl once. She did not need to. What she described needed no dramatic framing. Dates, locations, actions, the specific texture of 14 months. Facts, precisely organized. The courtroom was very still while she spoke. Even the stenographer seemed to be holding her breath. When she stepped down, she caught my eye from across the room. I nodded. She nodded. Dennis's attorney, a carefully groomed man from Kellner, Roth named Whitford, had built his defense on 2 pillars. First, that Amma's confinement had been a misunderstanding arising from a complicated and mutually agreed informal housing arrangement. And second, that the key witness for the prosecution, an elderly woman with no legal training and an admitted emotional investment in the outcome, had interpreted events through the distorting lens of grief and age. I had expected this. Howard and I had prepared for it. I was called in the afternoon. I took the stand in my good Navy dress, which I'd worn to Raymond's memorial service, and I told myself, "You are not a grieving woman. You are a witness. Those are different things, and today you are the second one." Whitford cross-examined me with a patience calibrated to seem like courtesy. He asked about my medical history, my sleep, whether I had ever experienced confusion or disorientation, whether I had discussed the case with other parties before filing my statement, whether my relationship with my son had been strained prior to these events. His questions were designed to make me seem like someone who had arrived at a conclusion and then assembled the facts to support it. A woman whose love had curdled into persecution, whose grief had calcified into something she'd mistaken for truth. I answered every question with the precision of someone who had spent 71 years learning which details matter and why. I did not become flustered. I did not become cold. I did not reach for emotion when fact was available. I was simply accurate, and accuracy, I have found, is the thing that makes a certain kind of person very uncomfortable. Whitford returned to the same questions twice from different angles, hoping to find inconsistency. He did not find any. Then the prosecution played the recording. Howard had submitted it the previous week. The kitchen conversation from the Sunday, when Dennis and Cheryl had come with the Dahlias. County law permitted single-party recording. My phone had been in my cardigan pocket, running through the entire visit. The audio was not perfect. There was the ambient sound of the refrigerator, occasional traffic from Clover Mill Road. But the voices were clear. Dennis was clear. You're a 71-year-old woman living alone. Your memory, your mental state, all of that becomes fair game. Cheryl was clear. We will make this as difficult as possible for you and for that girl. The courtroom had that particular quality of quiet that comes when a room of people is very still and very attentive. Not the quiet of indifference, the quiet of collective understanding, arriving all at once. Dennis was called to testify the following morning. He had prepared carefully. I could see the preparation in the controlled tempo of his answers, the thoughtful pauses, the self-correcting that was meant to look like honesty. But cross-examination is not a prepared speech, and the prosecutor, a young woman named Estela Vargas, who had spent 3 years in the county DA's trafficking unit, had a gift for the question that arrives from an unexpected angle, the question that assumes one fact in order to reveal the falseness of another. She asked Dennis to confirm a specific date. He confirmed it. She produced a cell tower record that placed him at a location inconsistent with the version of events he'd just confirmed. He hesitated. He revised. He said he might have been mistaken about the date. Whitford objected. The objection was overruled. She produced a bank statement. She produced the handwritten note in Cheryl's handwriting, photographed from my file cabinet. She asked Cheryl, who testified after Dennis, to confirm that she had written the note. Cheryl said she couldn't be certain it was hers. Estella produced 3 other handwriting samples from existing documents Cheryl had signed. She compared them on a display screen, side by side, for the courtroom to see. Cheryl said she couldn't be certain about those either. "Mrs. Hawkins Cole," Estella said, "are you telling this court that you cannot identify your own handwriting?" Cheryl's attorney intervened. But the moment was done. It exists in the record. It will always exist in the record. Some things, once they are in the light, cannot be put back. Dennis, in his final testimony, said something that I think he had been telling himself so long that he believed it, which is perhaps the most dangerous kind of lie, the kind you tell yourself until it becomes indistinguishable from memory. We were trying to help her. We made mistakes in how we did it, but our intentions— "Your intentions," Judge Rosario said from the bench, with a tone that required no further amplification and received none, "are not before this court. The actions are." Dennis stopped speaking. And in the silence, I saw it. Not guilt, not remorse. Those were still beyond him. But the specific, clarifying shock of a person who has run out of room to maneuver, who has told the last version of the story and found the room unmoved, who has come to the edge of the narrative they've been constructing for years and found nothing behind it but open air. What do you feel, I had asked myself many times in the past months, when you look at your son? On that Thursday afternoon, in that fluorescent-lit courtroom, looking at the man who had grown up at my table and learned to lie so fluently that he'd almost made me doubt my own eyes. I felt clear, not happy, not relieved, not angry, clear, the way a window feels after a long rain has washed it, and the light comes through properly for the first time in longer than you'd noticed. The verdict came on a Friday morning in March. I had not expected it to feel the way it felt. I had prepared myself, I thought, for every permutation, for a hung jury, for a partial conviction, for the particular exhaustion of a justice that arrives half-formed. I had told myself many times and with conviction that the process mattered as much as the outcome, that having stood up clearly and at cost was itself a kind of completion. But I am also a practical woman, and I will tell you plainly, when the forewoman read guilty on all counts, 4 counts, including federal trafficking charges that the DA's office had added in December, I put my hand over my mouth and I cried in a way I had not cried since the morning Raymond died. Dennis received 7 years. The federal sentencing guidelines for trafficking-related charges are not lenient, and the additional counts of fraud, witness intimidation, Yes, the recording. Yes, the certified letter with the cashier's check. And unlawful confinement had built a structure that Whitford and his firm, for all their resources, could not dismantle. Dennis stood at the defense table and received the sentence in a stillness that was either dignity or shock. From where I sat, I could not distinguish between them. Perhaps he couldn't either. Cheryl received 4 years. Her attorney had attempted a plea arrangement in the final weeks before trial, offering cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. The DA's office considered it and declined. The note in her handwriting, the fraudulent lease documents, the bank records showing deposits she had personally managed, the cooperation she could have offered was already in evidence. She cried during sentencing in a way that might have been genuine and might have been the final act of a woman who had been performing her entire adult life. I could not know. I chose not to speculate. What I can tell you is what I watched happen to Amma. Gerald Park stood beside her when the verdict was read. She didn't cry. She went very still, the way she had been still in my basement on the day I found her. But this was a different kind of stillness. Not the stillness of hiding. The stillness of something that has been wound so tightly for so long that it doesn't yet know how to release. Afterward, in the hallway, she let herself lean against the wall, and she laughed. A surprised, slightly chaotic sound. And Darlene put a hand on her shoulder and let her. The federal trafficking classification gave Amma immediate eligibility for a T visa, which Gerald had already prepared the application for. It was approved within 6 weeks. She had the right to remain. She had the right to work. She had the right to continue the education that had been suspended when Cheryl approached her with a laminated card and a warm smile at a church outreach meeting 2.5 years ago. She went back to school in the fall. Howard handled the civil side. The house was mine. It had always been mine, and there had never been any legitimate claim on it. But we made it formal and we made it airtight because I had learned the cost of assuming that obvious things are safe. Dennis and Cheryl's joint accounts, some of which contained housing assistance funds collected fraudulently in Amma's name, were frozen by court order and partially directed toward restitution. A portion came to Amma. It would not return what had been taken. Nothing could. But it was something solid, and solid things matter. Detective Reyes stopped by the house the week after sentencing. He sat at the kitchen table. I've stopped minding when people sit there, and drank my coffee and told me that the investigation had identified 3 additional potential victims connected to the same scheme in adjacent counties. 2 of them had come forward. The case was expanding. He was glad, he said, that I had made the call from Patricia's landline that September night. So am I said. A lot of people would have tried to handle it privately, he said. Not as a judgment, just as an observation. I know, I said. I almost did. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He left without making it more than it was, which is another thing I've learned to be grateful for. I went to the basement 2 weeks after the trial. Not immediately. I needed the interval. I went down with a box of contractor bags and Raymond's old shop light, and I cleaned. I removed what had been left there. I washed the concrete floor. I opened the window wells and let the March air come through, cold and clean and carrying the particular sharpness of a season that has decided to be new. I did not reseal it. The door is open. The stairs are solid. There is a new light fixture with a proper switch. What does victory feel like? It doesn't feel like triumph, exactly. Triumph is too bright, too uncomplicated. It feels more like winter light, pale and level and true, coming into a room that was dark for longer than it should have been. Spring came slowly that year, the way good things sometimes do. By degrees, apologetically. as if it weren't entirely sure it had permission to arrive. I planted the garden earlier than usual. The rose bushes along the south fence had needed attention for 2 years, and I gave it to them properly. That March, good compost, a careful pruning, the kind of work that asks nothing of you except patience and presence. Patricia came by on Saturdays, and we gardened in companionable parallel. By April, the first buds were showing. Amma called on a Tuesday in late spring from the campus library, where she'd re-enrolled. She was taking a full course load: environmental science, a calculus sequence, a seminar on water systems in West Africa that she described with an enthusiasm that reminded me of the way Raymond used to talk about woodworking when he'd found a new technique. She had 2 friends who were, she said, proper friends. She used the word proper with emphasis, the way someone does when they're distinguishing something from its lesser imitation. She came to the house for Thanksgiving. She brought a peanut stew her mother had taught her to make that filled the kitchen with a smell I didn't know but immediately liked. Patricia came. Darlene came. Tom Beaumont came with his wife. We sat at Raymond's table and ate until we were satisfied. Dennis served his sentence at a medium security facility 3 hours from the city. I did not visit. I did not write. I received 1 letter saying he was sorry without specifying for what. I put it in the fireproof lockbox. That decision is mine to make in my own time. Cheryl was released after 3 years with credit for good behavior. She moved to another state, her sister's house, then a rental. She lost her professional certifications. The church where she and Dennis had cultivated their standing quietly removed them from the membership rolls the week after the verdict. She was not my concern. Howard updated my will that autumn. I made Amma a beneficiary of a modest fund tied to her educational expenses. Not life-changing money, but intentional money. The kind that says, I see the direction you're going, and I want to help it. She didn't know about it. I planned to tell her when she graduated. I turned 72 in November. Patricia baked the cake. Tyler came by with a card everyone in the neighborhood had signed. I read every name. The wind chime by the kitchen window, the same one Raymond and I had hung in 1987, rang that evening in a late autumn gust. I stood in the doorway and listened. There is a kind of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of yourself within it. Standing upright, clear-eyed, still here. Now I do. I used to think wisdom meant knowing the right answers. I've learned it means refusing to accept the wrong ones, even when they arrive in a familiar voice, at your own kitchen table, with flowers. Do not look away. Not from what frightens you. Not from what your love makes you want to explain away. The truth, seen clearly and acted on with courage, is the only foundation that holds. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.